Okay, so it'll be video 2 for APUSH for Monday, April 20th. Alright, the first 3 points remain the most significant to the 14th Amendment to this very day and are basis for most lawsuits involving discrimination and civil rights. In fact, through a series of cases over the years, most of the First Amendments have been extended to the states through the due process of the 14th Amendment. It is helpful to remember the Bill of Rights protects the individual from federal government, while the 14th Amendment protects you from the state government. The 14th Amendment was intended to clarify the status of newly freed slaves, address the issue of citizenship raised by the Dred Scott decision, and limit the effects of the black codes. The radicals hoped to force states to either extend suffrage to black men or lose power in Congress. In the Swing Around the Circle public speaking tour, Johnson campaigned against the amendment and lost. In the congressional election of '66, the North voted for a Congress more heavily weighted towards radical end of the political spectrum. The new Congress quickly passed the Military Reconstruction Act of '67 and imposed martial law in the South. It also called for the new state constitutional conventions and forced the states to allow blacks to vote for the convention delegates. This act also required each state to ratify the 14th Amendment and to send its new constitution to Congress for approval. Aware that Johnson would oppose the new Reconstruction, Congress then passed a number of laws designed to limit the president's power. As expected, Johnson did everything in his power to counteract the congressional plan. The conflict reached its climax when the House Judiciary Committee initiated impeachment proceedings against Johnson, ostensibly for violating the Tenure of Office Act, which stated that the president had to secure the consent of the Senate before removing appointees that had been approved by that body. Johnson had fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a radical Republican who had been appointed by Lincoln, but really because he was getting in the way of Reconstruction. Johnson was acquitted by one vote in the Senate, but the trial rendered Johnson politically impotent, and he served the last few months of his presidency with no hope of re-election. With the new president, Ulysses S. Grant, in office, Congress forged ahead in its efforts to remake the South. The 15th Amendment, proposed in 1869, finally required states to enfranchise black men. Women's suffrage would have to wait another half-century. Ironically, the 15th Amendment passed only because Southern states were required to ratify it as a condition of re-entry into the Union. A number of Northern states opposed the amendment. All right, hang on a second. The failed Reconstruction. Reconstruction had its share of successes while the North occupied the South. The new state constitutions officially allowed all Southern men to vote and replaced many appointed government positions with elected positions. New Southern governments, directed mostly by transplanted Northern Republicans, blacks, and Southern moderates, created public schools and those social institutions such as orphanages popularized in the North during the Reform movement in the 30s. New governments also stimulated industrial and rail development in the South through loans, grants, and tax exemptions. The fact that blacks were serving in Southern government represented a huge step forward, given the seemingly insurmountable restrictions placed on blacks only a few years earlier, though it would prove to be only temporary victory. However, ultimately Reconstruction failed, although government industrialization plans helped rebuild the Southern economy. These plans also cost a lot of money. High tax rates turned public opinion, already antagonistic to Reconstruction, even more hostile. Opponents waged a propaganda war against Reconstruction, calling it Southerners who cooperated scallywags and Northerners who ran the programs carpetbaggers. Many of who participated in Reconstruction were indeed corrupt, selling their votes for money and favors. It should be noted that Northerners were just as guilty as Southerners of corruption. The period following the Civil War is also known as the Gilded Age, to suggest that the tarnish that lay beneath the layer of gold. This is the era of political machines and bosses, which will be discussed in a later chapter. Political scandal was not new at the time, and in fact, Grant's administration was racked with political scandals and intrigue. Grant himself supposedly innocent and oblivious to these goings-on of the administration. Grant had no political experience when he became president. In fact, he was elected because he was a popular war hero, not an experienced political leader. Like Jackson, Grant appointed his friends and supporters to government positions, not necessarily those men most qualified, let alone those with most integrity. Unfortunately, although Grant was honest, his friends were not. A series of scandals broke out in the 1870s, and while you don't need to know the details for the AP test, there's a lot of them listed here, like Black Friday, Credit Mobilier scandal, which we talked about. Let's see, Whiskey Ring scandal we talked about. There's other ones listed too, but that's the main ones. These scandals diverted the public's attention away from post-war conditions in the South. The Civil War was officially over. A war of intimidation began, spearheaded by the insurgent groups ranging from secretive terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who focused on murdering freedmen, to openly operating paramilitary forces such as the White League, who focused on murdering Republicans. These combinations amount to war, declared Attorney General Amos Ackerman, who had been posted to the Carolinas to try to speed trials of the Klansmen along. A problem because local judges tended to be Klansmen as well. In some towns, the entire adult male population were engaged in battle against Reconstruction. Southern officials explained their failure to do anything to protect blacks and Republicans by complaining that if they obeyed their orders to round up insurgents, there would be mass starvation because nobody would be left to work. Also because Reconstruction did nothing to redistribute the South's wealth or guarantee that the freedmen would own property. It did very little to alter the basic power structure of the region. Southerners knew that when Northerners left, as it inevitably would, things would return to a condition much closer to the way it was before Reconstruction. As early as 1869, the federal government began to sending signals that it would soon ease up restrictions. President Grant enforced the law loosely, hoping to lessen tensions and thereby hasten an amicable reunion. Worse, throughout the 60s and 70s, the Supreme Court consistently restricted the scope of the 14th and 15th Amendment. In the slaughterhouse cases, the court ruled the 14th Amendment applied only to the federal government and not to state governments, an opinion of the court strengthened in the United States versus Cruikshank. In United States versus Reese, the court cleared the way for grandfather clauses, poll taxes, literacy tests, property requirements, and other restrictions on voting privileges. Soon, nearly all southern states had restrictive laws that effectively prevented blacks from voting. Finally, because Grant's administration was so thoroughly corrupt, it tainted everything which was it was associated with, including Reconstruction. Let's read one more and we'll be done. During the 1872 election, moderates calling themselves liberal Republicans abandoned the coalition that supported Reconstruction. Angered by widespread corruption, this group hoped to end federal control of the South. Although their candidate Horace Greeley did not defeat Grant, they made gains in the congressional and state elections. As a result, Grant moved further away from the radical position and closer to conciliation. Several congressional acts, among them the Amnesty Act of 72, pardoned many of the rebels, thus allowing them to re-enter public life. Other crises, such as the financial panic of 73, drew the nation's attention away from Reconstruction. By 76, Southern Democrats had regained control of most of the region's state legislatures. These Democrats called themselves Redeemers, and their use of the word redemption suggested they intended to reverse Republican Reconstruction policies as they returned to power. So there's a little bit more left on that packet, but I'm going to stop there. Go ahead and read the key concepts from this. This is Course Guidebook Unit 5, period 1844-1877. I'll pick it up with topic 5.8, Military Conflict and Civil War, and we'll kind of read from there and finish this up. Both the Union and the Confederacy mobilized their economies and societies to wage war even while facing considerable home front opposition. Although Confederacy showed military initiative and daring in the war, the Union ultimately succeeded due to improvements in leadership and strategy, key victories, greater resources, and the wartime destruction of the South's infrastructure. All right, government policies during the Civil War. Lincoln and most Union supporters began the Civil War to preserve the Union, but Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation reframed the purpose for the war and helped prevent the Confederacy from gaining full diplomatic support from European powers. Many African Americans fled southern plantations and enlisted the Union Army, helping to undermine the Confederacy. Lincoln sought to reunify the country and used speeches such as the Gettysburg Address to portray the struggle against slavery as a fulfillment of America's founding democratic ideals. All right, 5.10, Reconstruction. Reconstruction altered relationships between the states and the federal government and led to debates over new definitions of citizenship, particularly among rights of African Americans, women, and other minorities. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, while the 14th and 15th Amendments granted African American citizenship, equal protection under the laws, and voting rights. Women's rights movement was both emboldened and divided over the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, more on that later on. Efforts by radical and moderate Republicans to change the balance of power between Congress and the presidency and reorder race relations in the defeated South yielded some short-term successes. Reconstruction opened up political opportunities and other leadership roles to former slaves, but ultimately failed due to both determined Southern resistance and Northern waning resolve. All right, we'll cover the failure of Reconstruction tomorrow. Y'all have a good day. See you later.